Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a what we have learned video. If you've never watched this video series before, I take the time during the international break to sort of reassess what we think about Premier League teams from an attacking point of view, a defensive point of view, and just in terms of their improvement or even, worsening in terms of team quality over the course of the season, and obviously taking in comparison some of the historical context that we have. So I'd like to shout out 11ify at the start of this video. He's someone that I respect greatly. He does a lot of work in terms of team strength that is very useful for me as an FPL manager myself to try and understand the landscape of FPL from a team narrative perspective. So have a look at his website at 11ify.com. You'll find a lot of these very, very useful data sets in terms of visualizations as well. And ultimately, once again, thanks to him for producing some of the content that you'll see for this video because it's very, very illustrative. So the starting position of this series is to probably just look at, where we think teams are at now. And I always find that this chart is always the best in terms of visualizing how much of a gap there is between certain teams, but then also sort of understanding, whether it's really coming from attack or whether it's coming from defense. So the teams at the top right quadrant of this graph are clearly the better attacks, the better defenses. Top left being better defenses, worse attacks. Bottom left being worse attack, worse defense. So effectively, you can say for now what would be the worst teams within the league. And then in the bottom right quadrant, teams that are more better attacks and worse defenses. So teams that you'd probably look at as very competent attacks, but not necessarily great for clean sheets and all. The most important thing I would say to illustrate is when you look at teams like Arsenal, City, and Liverpool, how much of a gulf there is between them, even versus City, but then also specifically when you look at the gaps between a team like Chelsea, Tottenham, Newcastle, or even Aston Villa. These are probably the teams that, based on team models or even by the bookies, are contending for that sort of top 4 spot within the Champions League. And you can already see that there is a huge gulf in terms of the understanding based on 11ify's team model here. And what I think is so interesting is when you look at a team like Arsenal, we've always associated them as being the best defense, potentially for, I would say, one season now. And they still remain close there, but it seems like Man City is very, very close on defense. And I know someone else in terms of Simon on Twitter, Analytic FPL, who probably has his own team model with Man City as a slightly better defense to Arsenal. I think anything that we can say about the big gulf between a team like Arsenal and City is definitely represented through the attacking gulf in quality. So this illustration here just shows the big difference. And with Liverpool, I think the interesting thing is that we've always seen them as a very competent attack. So better than Arsenal, but definitely a step off the defense. And if you look at last season, in terms of where we contextualize some of these teams, we know that Liverpool were definitely in that sort of bracket where they were potentially even actually the best attack within the league, but then very comfortably not close to the level of Arsenal and City on a defensive aspect. But the big difference that I think a lot of people would immediately point out to me now is what about slot? And I do think that we'll look into some other sort of visualizations later that show how much of a stride Liverpool have already made within the first 3 games of the season. And another thing to illustrate, of course, is we're only 3 games rather into the season. So there's no need to take away massive conclusions. But a lot of these team models are very useful for us because they actually look at a lot of data sets and a lot of sort of data points as well to kind of get an understanding of this, so that when you only have 3 game weeks of information, that it's only just building a sort of slight understanding or improvement in understanding on what we historically understood from the last season and years past as well. So yes, of course, when a new manager comes in, when new players come in, we can definitely see team strength changes and they can be quite volatile. But it's also worth understanding how long it takes for a team to really represent how good they are. And of course, it just shows you the bar that was already set by teams like Arsenal and City in the past. So that is what I find interesting. I think we'll talk about Liverpool defense in a moment. Within Chelsea, Tottenham, and Newcastle, I think early doors, we can probably say that Newcastle look the worst of all these teams. Chelsea have not necessarily gotten the results that I think we've probably expected from them. They actually are still within a good run of fixtures. So when we talk about fixtures to target later within the series, there'll be an interesting talking point. As far as Tottenham, still very comfortably a good attack, pretty borderline average defense, but that's no different to last season. I think what's interesting too when we look at a team like Tottenham is, them not being too far out, so them not even actually slipping into that sort of worse defense quadrant is a good sign, right? Because I think a lot of us hold Tottenham in a lot worse of a regard when it comes to defensive quality. So that's nice to see. And it does seem like maybe early doors, that these three teams are close to getting top four, but I think Aston Villa have been quite impressive to me so far. So that's something that I'd like to look into when we look at the actual improvement in rating in a bit later. With Man United, I have to say they've started the season very poorly once again. I think we've had 2-3 years now straight of Man United playing very, very poor when it comes to underlying data. Yes, they've overperformed it a couple of years now, but there's nothing that I would say intrinsic to Man United that means that that's, necessarily the case. We also see consistently poor performances, and for that reason as well, we didn't see them creep into the top four last season. So there's been a genuine sort of worsening of the team year on year, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely worthless to look at as a team. I mean, when you look at, let's say, in terms of where they sit on attack, they're still a competent attack, right? At least being in the top half. So there's still ways that I think we can look at teams like United and still say that we could actually like to go for them. And of course, fixtures are a huge decider in that. Brighton is probably bang in the middle, but I would actually like to see a team like Brighton and see where they can sort of move into later down the line in the season, because I think early sort of data that we have from Brighton in terms of the first 3 games under Fabian basically suggests that they're a very, very good team. And I would like to see, of course, if they bridge that gap with the teams like Chelsea and Tottenham. In terms of, let's say, points on the board, I mean, they've already scored 7, so that's very huge. But in terms of team strength, that's where the gap will take a little bit more of a while to close, because it's not really just looking at pure outcomes, but rather just the underlying data outcomes of your performances. And of course, 1, 2, 3 games is not enough sample size. In terms of other teams I'd like to call out, you can see the sort of promoted teams, they're very, very clearly close to each other. Southampton, unfortunately, looking like a very, very poor attack. And I think that's something that we've seen so far. Even when they were, let's say, 10 versus 11 versus Newcastle, that was probably their best offensive performance. And so it's not exactly a great look that needed to come about for us to sort of see a good Southampton attacking performance. I think they had chances versus Brentford as well, if we want to put it like that. But it's clear that these are all the teams to target for the remainder of the season until we see, more changes and more drastic changes. So something like Wolves is interesting because I feel like they've shown to be a little bit more of a competent attack so far, but the defense actually, there's still quite a bit of a gulf there between defense more so than attack. But when I look at a team like Wolves, just early from the season, from my own perspective, watching them play, I do find that they look comfortably worse as a defense, but then pretty actually interesting on the attacking point of view. And I think that Chelsea game is a good illustration of how it looks in terms of outcomes. But even on underlying performance in that game versus Chelsea, it's not like they were conceding that many chances. They just gave away, I think, a lot of positions that were very poor, particularly towards that sort of Palmer to Madueke and the transition-based nature of the game. So that's interesting. In terms of other sort of metrics, I think in the past, I've always identified Crystal Palace as the quintessential good defense, but then worse offense teams. And I feel like Everton last season very comfortably crept into that corner, but because of their such poor performances so far, we now find them in that sort of bottom left quadrant, which is not where you want to be. But a team like Nottingham Forest, I would say, are probably continuing to actually look quite good on defense. And I think they can comfortably sort of take a similar mantle to Crystal Palace in terms of where these metrics lie. We will continue to monitor teams like West Ham, Bournemouth, and Brentford as well, because I feel like they are also the potential contenders that can move closer towards the middle, and we'll continue to sort of follow that progress as the season goes on. So that's kind of the team ratings as a whole. Let's actually look at the change in defense. So this graphic, once again, provided by 11fi. Have a look at his website. He provides extremely useful data. But this is the change in the defense model rating for the 24-25 season since game week 1. So we have 3 game weeks of data now. How have teams moved? And what I find interesting is that you've seen a slight improvement in Man City, slight deprovement in a team like Arsenal, but Liverpool, out of all the teams in the league, making the most drastic improvement. And once again, this goes hand in hand with the other part of the Merseyside derby, with Everton moving in the opposite direction. So these are the teams that have moved the most. And it's very interesting because I think when you think about even, let's say, the quality of defense, what you're looking at here in terms of these data points of 0.8, 1.0, 1.2, etc., this is actually almost the average expected goals conceded per game of the team, right? So the lower you are, the more left hand you find a team, the better they are as a defense, because you're expecting them to concede less goals per game or less chances per game that build up, certain XG. So Liverpool have looked really good so far. But I think one thing to point out is, first of all, Man City and Arsenal have done nothing wrong. They've been very elite defenses for the last year, whereas Liverpool have obviously lagged behind. So for Slot to really catch up to where City and Arsenal are would take a lot of time for us to sort of appreciate that, but we're already starting to appreciate just how good of a defense they are. Some interesting signs, I think, is Chelsea, Spurs, even teams like Brighton actually looking pretty good on defense. Nottingham Forest that I talked about too. So a lot of teams have actually moved in the positive direction. I think we've also targeted them so far. Even in Aston Villa, you can argue that there's been a bit of a tactical shift, right? You have Onana joining the team. There's a very clear pivot now with Tielemans and Onana. Maybe that's having a little bit of a positive, understanding of the, let's say, defense of Aston Villa. Maybe playing fullbacks, I guess, in their default positions as well, things like that. And we'll continue to monitor that because Aston Villa actually have a really good run of games soon, and we'll see how they perform over that. On the other hand, we know that Everton have actually looked really poor, unfortunately, on defense, and part of that is personnel related with someone like Branthwaite not being a part of the team right now, but that's just been a very glaring sign this season. With a team like West Ham, I wonder if that's also because there is just simply, look, they've probably strengthened more so on attack than I would say defense, and I'd be curious to see if whether there's a consistent sort of worsening within the team overall, because I think West Ham's probably one of the early teams that we've seen so far where they clearly were teams that we'd probably look at to target. Another thing that I would say is a huge point in the sample size is them facing Man City and getting absolutely destroyed. So I wonder how much that has to play in terms of the change in the defense rating. But that's it, I would say. Not too much to really say with some of these promoted teams. Nottingham Forest probably the interesting one. Fulham as well, considering that they did lose Palhinha. So them actually performing well in defense is a positive sign. But this is, of course, a good run of games. And of course, whilst these models should take into account team strengths of their opponents and things like that, that, let's say, when you face off versus a team like Man City, I think that the game is what I would consider to be a little bit more of an outlier than anything else, right? So it also helps give a little bit more context in terms of some of these movements. And you can see these movements are very minimal too. So that's, I think, the beauty of looking at a team defense rating is that you're not just looking at the Premier League points table and just saying, okay, we're just going to rank the teams in terms of how good they are based on where they are on the table 3 game weeks in. We're just going to really just look at how minute the differences are in terms of our understanding of defense and our understanding of offense. So let's quickly look into offense as well. I mean, offense is going to be an interesting one because offense is one where you can see actually the league is much more close on offense. So when we compare it to the defense metric just now, you saw a gigantic gulf between City and Arsenal, then Liverpool, then the rest of the league. Here on offense, it's kind of like a nice, basically diagonal line. So almost looking like a strong correlation. It's just effectively a gradient of better offense, right? So better offense sits now towards the right-hand side. And if you looked at, let's say, the defense rating and looked at that as expected goals conceded per game, now you can kind of look at attack team rating as if it was expected goals for the actual team itself. So the further right you are, the better of an offense you are. And Liverpool, of course, already still making some decent improvements. But I think the most impressive aspect of Liverpool so far is defense. And I think when we talk about players like Luis Diaz, like Diogo Jota, and even Mo Salah, I think one thing is sort of respecting that they were already very, very competent. And I think we understood how good they are from the offensive point of view last season. But it's really still actually in defense that we think that Liverpool have made the most impressive improvement. So whilst Liverpool have definitely improved in my estimation, small sample size sort of taken into account, I think we don't need to overrate necessarily how good Liverpool have been as an offense. Arsenal, unfortunately, dropping a little bit back. Same with Newcastle. And a lot more sort of, I think, nerfings of teams like Leicester, Southampton, Ipswich. One thing to mention with some of these promoted teams, unfortunately, is it's not an exact science that we have in place in terms of understanding how they will play within the Premier League. So I appreciate that a lot of team models or even the markets have different ways of trying to understand how a team like Leicester, Southampton, Ipswich will perform. But it's already interesting to see that within 11-5 team model that we've seen a little bit of a clawback in terms of the offense. And that's, once again, another good sign if you're looking for clean sheets against these teams, things like that. Crystal Palace, a little bit of a drop back. I think that's understood because of some of the personnel. They've also, got some new personnel within the team. We wonder how much that changes things. But the most, improved team so far is Bournemouth and Brighton, even West Ham a little bit. So one thing to mention with West Ham, as I said previously, is, of course, we've seen a little bit of a clawback in terms of defense, but the offense still looks to be very good for all intents and purposes. As far as Bournemouth and Brighton, we know that there have been some key players joining these teams, but also some key players stepping up. So Semenyo, for example, has been absolutely amazing so far in the Premier League season, and his underlying data has been incredible. But I do also expect that he's not going to maintain that level where he's effectively a top 10 attacker in the league. That might drop off a little bit. Whereas a team like Brighton overall, it seems like they're enjoying very much the start of the season. They have some very clear changes within the team. So Minte is a very clear starter to the team. You've got João Pedro back fit, a new manager, a slightly different team in terms of the midfield as well. And so it's a positive sign for Brighton. And we know that there's some players yet to play a larger role within this team, like Jorginho Rutter, maybe even getting starts in the future. Gruda off the bench. So much more depth right now for a team like Brighton. And then also someone like Kadioglu who can play in some of these offensive fullback positions, and Estupiñán coming back fit, not to mention Evan Ferguson as well. So for me, these are sort of interesting data points to look at. And I think once again, most glaring, the drop-off is very clear within teams like Arsenal and Newcastle. Both of these teams, unfortunately, did play 10 versus 11 for significant amounts of some of the matches that they've played. But we'll see and monitor these two teams in terms of their offense. Because I think one thing that I can say for Newcastle is that they've just generally looked quite poor. Even in the Tottenham game, for example, where they were playing 11 versus 11, I wasn't particularly impressed. And we do hold Newcastle in an extremely high regard at home compared to away. So that's one of those fixtures where I look at them and think, okay, I'm expecting something really, really good there, but not necessarily actually seeing it within that game. So very interesting sort of movements there in terms of team ratings. Now let's actually move on to fixture analysis and fixtures to target, really from a teams to target perspective. So we actually looked at defense first, and let's look at defense first again in terms of teams to target. Now what I find so interesting here is we're going to ignore City, Arsenal, Liverpool. These are very obvious teams. But I think with Aston Villa, they're very clearly the team that I would say have a standout run of games where arguably there's no poor games here for the level of defense that they are. You'll see here as well how much of a gulf there is between teams like Aston Villa and City and Arsenal. It's not worth actually looking at a City and Arsenal game and even considering what the context is for what a good defensive sort of game is. Because when you see a team like Arsenal and City facing off, they've got 22 and 34% chance to get a clean sheet versus each other. Whereas actually for most teams like Aston Villa, you're begging for a chance to get 35% of a clean sheet odd for any particular game. Like that's a great game for a team. And so you can already see how much of a gulf there is, and also how much of a lack of expectation that we have in the Premier League in getting clean sheets. So when we've seen the data for the last few seasons, and I think Rob T has been someone who's been really good at presenting that to us, we've seen less clean sheets year on year, more goals scored year on year. And so it makes it even tougher to sort of target defenses specifically. But actually still having a look at a metric like this is very helpful because at least you're still squeezing in a slightly higher probability of getting a clean sheet within a certain team. So when people talk about Konsa and Pau Torres a lot, and even Emi Martinez, I think this is very illustrative of that. So Aston Villa have a great run of games. Brighton as well, Everton as well, even with the context of them being slightly worse. I think one thing to mention is that I don't think we can see them drop off a cliff entirely, and Brentford will come back into the team in due time. So we do expect that Everton will hopefully not be conceding 2 to 3 games consistently week on week, and I think that's hopefully an outlier. As far as Crystal Palace, we've already known that they have some defensive reinforcements, and I think a lot of people have overstepped a little bit too much, in my opinion, in terms of how much worse they are as a team. Okay, yes, they've lost players like Elise, yes, they've lost players like Anderson, but they have actually, at least from the defensive point of view, I would say definitely stocked up in terms of quality. So Chalobah is a great option. Having Lacroix as a defensive rotation option is also very good. As far as, let's say, offense, we might have a different view of Crystal Palace, but here, of course, as you can see, clean sheet's still something that we can look for, particularly, of course, with Gameweek 4. Another thing to look at, too, is teams like Chelsea United and Brentford. They're pretty far away from the rest of the pack, but then we clearly have some attackers who are defenders who are very good. So Pedro Porro, great example of that. In Chelsea, you can argue maybe someone like Augusto, but I still think that he's probably a pick that I would swerve because I really do wonder whether his position in the team is absolutely nailed if Reece James comes back from his recent injury. And then, of course, if Cucurella gets to keep his spot as a very progressive sort of left back within the team and a natural left back. So that's an interesting thing. As far as, let's say, some of the teams above in Brighton too, I mean, this will be kind of scoped to see and maybe ask the question of, do we go for some of the fullbacks in the team that I think right now aren't really nailed within Estupiñán, with Kadioglu, with even Veltman, for example, or Hinchelwood, and then actually consider, for example, just going for the center back. So Dunk and Van Heck. These are the most interesting options for Brighton for now, but more so, I would say Verbruggen is extremely interesting. So he is a goalkeeper that seems to be the #1 goalkeeper this season. We've seen the manager already discuss that he doesn't want to do rotating goalkeepers. He's already played Verbruggen in the previous match, so he's a very clear option to target. As far as some of the options from other teams, unfortunately with United, I still don't think there are too many great defensive options that I'd really look at right now. You will in time, I think, find someone like Mazraoui quite interesting, but I really think that this is a good illustration of, unfortunately, how lowly we sort of rate Man United defense, and how even a 4.5 defender from Man United isn't even the sort of main priority of a lot of players. You might even prefer going for a Brentford option as well. If Rico Henry, for example, recovers and is able to play sort of consistent games of football by, let's say, game week 7, game week 8, I mean, he's a very, very good pick. Across the board, I would say with some of the other teams, I'd probably not be targeting them from defense right now. So unfortunately, we're just going to move away from the defense teams to target and actually move swiftly towards goals. And the thing that I'll point out first of all is the big change within attack versus defense. So here you see Chelsea much higher up within this list. You see a team like Spurs much higher up in this list. And that's actually helpful too, because when you're looking at maybe things like attacking fullbacks, like someone like Pedro Porro, who's literally, if you were to, let's say, probably take freeze frames of a team like Spurs every single time they actually play and they're in possession, I would find that Pedro Porro is going to be one of the 5 attackers within the team as opposed to one of the 5 defenders. And so Pedro Porro, of course, with Spurs, very interesting to target. Same with Brighton, potentially, if we can find a pick eventually, but then we're also going to potentially miss out on game weeks 4 and 5. So that's why someone like Dunk, who could potentially be on free kicks, who definitely is a great set piece threat anyways, is going to be very interesting. Teams like Man United a little bit higher here, teams like Newcastle as well. And then conversely, of course, we see a drop-off with a team like Crystal Palace, but that's always something that we've seen even last season. So I think what I find so interesting about people sort of criticizing someone like Eze is, yes, of course, Eze isn't going to be producing, let's say, expected goal involvement at the level of, you know, a City, Liverpool, Arsenal player or attacker. That is a key talisman of the team. But the key thing is that he has everything, right? Set pieces, he has penalties, he has great minutes. And so he's also a shot spammer as well in open play. And I feel like when people look at a team like Crystal Palace, they'll just think that, you know, we're going to ignore Eze because Crystal Palace are an inoffensive team. But I think we miss out on how much of a key threat he is and how much of the share of goals, how much of the share of assists that Eze is most likely going to get playing within a Crystal Palace. So here it's also, I think, interesting to sort of separate, not just looking at teams in terms of attack, but then also specifically trying to understand within, let's say, the data that we can see for attack, how important a player is to that sort of production outcome, right? So if we think that Crystal Palace could score 8.42 goals, obviously it's going to be a whole number, but you get the point. It's mostly going to come from someone like Eze, or maybe even someone like Mateta, but he also plays 65, 75 minutes a game, and that's quite limited compared to, let's say, someone like Eze, who's close to 85, 90. And the same goes with someone like Brian Mbeumo as well. We rate him extremely highly, but he's only within a top 10 offense within the next six fixtures. And obviously this will get better as Brentford go past game weeks 4 and 5, where they face City and also Tottenham. But you already kind of understand that it's actually better to have someone who's a talisman than someone who's just playing in an offensive position for an offensive team. It works the same way, or it works the opposite way too when you look at someone like Morgan Rogers, where I think if you're playing 90 minutes for a really offensive team, you're still going to benefit. The same goes for someone like Luis Diaz or Jota. Like, you've seen that them naturally get a plenty amount of chances because they play for a very, very strong offense within Liverpool. But there's a fine line to sort of match. So if I went to a team like Man United, it's a little bit harder to pick really good offensive options outside of Bruno, because a lot of the other players now are showing very poor minutes, right? Where we're seeing rotation between Rashford, Ahmad, and Garnacho, and it's harder to sort of glean as to which are the best assets of them, because you can't guarantee each game whether they're going to play 90 minutes and actually going to enjoy a lot of the goal share, the assist share for these teams. Another point I'd like to mention too is, of course, when we look at a team like West Ham, this I think is the emergence of the generally better run of games that West Ham have, right? The first 3 fixtures were pretty poor for them. You've come over the Man City game. This is probably the time to actually consider some West Ham assets. Bournemouth are up there as well. And honestly, the pack of teams between, let's say, Brentford and Crystal Palace, that's not a huge gap, right? Ultimately, I think a lot of the picks from these teams are very interesting. Semenyo for sure has popped out. I mean, he was actually my Game Week 1 first draft, if you guys remember from the channel. And I find it so funny that he's been doing amazing, whilst I believe I started the season with someone called Nkunku, who I won't mention anymore in this video. But it's just interesting to see how well Bournemouth have looked so far and how key he has been to their sort of offensive outcomes. Part of that, as I said, is also because of the lack of depth in the team. So when you look at, let's say, offenses, it's very good to still get players who play 90 minutes a game, because you're going to guarantee that they're going to enjoy really in the fruits of their team's labor from an offensive point of view. So that's the only thing I'd say. I'd say Fulham is also really low here. Same with Everton. So with maybe exception to someone like Dominic Calvert-Lewin, I think we're going to see a slow, gradual decline of, let's say, the amount of Fulham players and maybe even, let's say, potentially teams like, let's say, Southampton, Wolves, maybe we're also a lot colder on these teams and their players, and maybe Nottingham Forest as well. So you can start to see the sales of players like Chris Wood as they enter slightly tougher runs of games. Maybe Smith Rowe is a transfer out in the future, Muniz as well. But of course, game weeks 4 and 5 are still good for Fulham. So it's just about when you choose to sell. Whereas for Nottingham Forest, it makes sense to sell now. So I think these are the very interesting data points that we can mention to right now in terms of swings in the landscape. And of course, speaking widely about the offense, I find Spurs to be definitely a team to target as soon as game week 5, but then also maybe around game week 8, right? So if we find that Solanke is incredibly fit, I mean, he's going to be a player that we definitely should be targeting if his minutes remain as good as they looked like in game week 1 before he got injured. As far as Chelsea, I think that the one sort of thing that holds me back to anyone that isn't Cole Palmer, to be quite honest, is just the minutes, right? Jackson is doing incredibly well. He's actually started off really hot, but he's playing 65, 75 minutes a game. That's worse than, let's say, Pochettino's Jackson, where he was playing 90 minutes a game. And that's why I'm a little bit colder on someone like Jackson for now, even though he's performing so well, because I'm just fully wary that he's playing 65 minutes a game or 70, and as opposed to 90. In terms of, let's say, a team like Aston Villa, I think Watkins is once again the interesting question. He's not playing for England in the international break. He seems like he's going to get this time to hopefully build up his fitness, and we'll see that his minutes rise, hopefully. But that's not a guarantee, because it seems like Duran's obviously important enough to take the minutes away from Watkins, and we will have to just monitor how his minutes sort of flow through the rest of the season, because the reality is this year they're in the Champions League as opposed to the Conference League, and that's going to have a huge impact in terms of where Watkins gets to spend his minutes of football. In the previous season, we saw a lot more deep rotation for a team like Aston Villa, which we'll probably see for a team like Chelsea this season, right? Cole Palmer has not been included within the Conference League squad. However, Aston Villa are in the Champions League, and that means someone like Watkins will be playing those matches. I really do think that this is the season where his minutes will not be 90 minutes. And of course, that's a very obvious conclusion to make, because he's already not played 90 for 3 games straight. So these are some interesting points that I'd like to say in terms of teams to target. Definitely, I'd still be looking at teams from the top quadrant here, but then also still being wary of how good certain players are within that 10 to 14 landscape. You know, players like him, players like Eze, players like Semenyo. And then even from the West Ham perspective, this is around the time where you can consider a player like Bowen, because his minutes are perfect. And he's a very key player to that team who always has really good open play underlying numbers. So that's what I'd like to say in terms of what we've learned. I hope you guys have enjoyed the series. A little bit of a look into the early Premier League season data with the context, of course, of the past. Take into account, thankfully, to 11ify and his great work. So have a look at his channel once again, but more specifically his website, 11ify.com. Thank you guys for watching this video. Take care and goodbye.